guys, welcome to my channel. So today I'm going to be doing my eyeshadow palette collection. Along with that, I'm also going to give you a mini review, basically doing the pros and the cons for each palette. I'm also going in order of brands. Also, if you see the price listed, then that means the palette is still sold. So let's get started. The first palette...
I'm already messing up. Excuse me.
The first palette I have is the Anastasia Beverly Hills Self-Made palette. The pros for this palette is its beautiful and unique shadows. The shadows are very blendable, pigmented, and creamy. Also beginner friendly. A few cons for this palette is it's hard to create looks using this palette. For me, this is a one shadow palette, meaning when I use this palette, I'm using it to go in while I'm creating a look and just use one or two shades. For me, this is not a palette I would create a whole look using just this palette. Okay, next we have the Anastasia Beverly Hills Modern Renaissance palette. The pros for this palette, once again, beautiful shadows. It's a warm tone lover's palette. If you like cool tones, this palette is not going to be for you. It's also very beginner friendly. Also, highly blendable, pigmented, creamy shadows. For me, Anastasia Beverly Hills formula is one of the best formulas on the market. Also, you can create many looks using this palette. There are so many things you can do with just this palette. It is also a good mix of shimmer and matte shadow, and there's good transition shades. The only con that I have for this palette is it gets easily dirty. Usually when you have like the felt velvet, I don't know what to call it, but the material you have on this palette and the Naked One, shadow just clings to it and it's almost impossible to get it clean. So that is the one thing I do not like about this palette. Next we have the Urban Decay Naked 2. The pros for this palette is a cool tone lover's palette. There is a matte black. A lot of people like a matte black. For me, I don't really care. I don't really use black that often. I have black, so if I need it, I can get it, but I don't really have to have it. They're also good quality eyeshadows. The eyeshadows are very pigmented and blendable. The cons for this palette is there's not enough matte shades. There's only 3 shades, and Urban Decay did not use these 3 matte shades to make good transition shades. For me, 90% of the time, if I'm using a transition shade, it's going to be matte. And there's just not transition shades in this palette, so it's really hard for me to create a look. Next, we have the Urban Decay Naked 3. The pros for this palette, very gorgeous shadows. Urban Decay always does a good job at creating unique, beautiful shadows. The quality of these shadows is great. They're pigmented, blendable, creamy. The palette goes from light to dark, so it's a very beginner-friendly palette. It's also a warm tone person's palette. Okay, I have a half con for this. It's something that's like kind of bad, but not as bad. So there's still only 3 matte shades. But this time Urban Decay utilized these 3 matte shades to be good transition shades. So you can kind of see where it's kind of bad, not too bad. Next we have the Urban Decay Urban Spectrum palette. If you hear me like rattling papers in the background, it's because I had to write all these things down because there's no way I'd remember it all. So the pros for this palette is there's gorgeous colors, very unique shades, good quality, creamy, pigmented, and also easy to keep the packaging clean. The cons I have for this palette, packaging easily opens, so it's not going to be a travel-friendly palette. And there's also no matte shades, but this is, like what I said before, a one-shade palette. Or one shadow palette. Next we have Urban Decay Alice Through the Looking Glass. The pros for this palette are there are very unique shades. There's also transition shades. This is a very good and colorful palette, but you have those transition shades to make a look with the colorful shades. Also, shadows, good quality, pigmented, blendable, and creamy. There's also beautiful packaging. This is a Disney collector's piece. The cons that I have for this palette is bulky packaging, Sometimes when you get bulky packaging, you tend to stay away from using it because you want to reach for something light, sleek, easy to use. Some of the shades blend away to almost nothing. Unfortunately, that is something that happens in palettes. I didn't really like that about this palette. Next, we have the packaging is designed in a way that makes the eyeshadows easy to fall out, so it's not going to be travel friendly. Next, we have the Urban Decay Gwen Stefani palette. The pros is good mix of shimmers and mattes. There's great transition shades. It's a good beginner palette. The eyeshadows are decent quality. However, it's not the standard Urban Decay quality. A lot of times when you see collaborations with celebrities or YouTubers, etc., the quality is not there as if it were to be a normal palette like the Naked 3, Naked 1, Naked 2, if you kind of get what I'm saying. Next is good quality. They're creamy shadows. Most of them are pigmented. I really like the shimmers in this. It's cute and it's travel-friendly packaging. The cons for this are shadows are hit and miss. Almost all the shimmers are good, but like I said before, the matte shades, it's kind of a hit and miss thing. Especially the matte black in this palette, it really lacks pigmentation. Next, we have the Too Faced Chocolate Bar palette. The pros for this palette, it's a great beginner palette. It's good quality, pigmented, blendable, creamy. There's a good mix of shimmer and matte shades. Also, there's a big pan of the highlight shades. For me personally, I go through the highlight shades quicker than any other shade. And I think you'll see this throughout that video when you see my palettes. But I really appreciated that Urban Decay did that. Also, it's a nice neutral palette. But then you also have some fun pops of color. Sturdy packaging and travel friendly. The con that I have for this is the really sparkly shades lack pigmentation. Next, we have the Semi-Sweet Chocolate Bar by Too Faced. Same pros as the original chocolate bar, except for this time, I think not Urban Decay, Too Faced might have reformulated the really sparkly shades because they're a bit more pigmented. They're still not great, but I noticed that they are a bit more pigmented. The cons this time, okay, with the original chocolate bar palette, they set the bar really high, especially for color selection. And when you get to the Semi-Sweet Chocolate Bar palette, the color selection is not as good. They just did not... It's a good palette, don't get me wrong, but they did not hit the bar this time like the original one did. Next, we have the Too Faced Chocolate Bonbons palette. It's the same pros as the original chocolate bar and the Semi-Sweet Chocolate Bar palette. Except for this time I felt there was a better color selection like in the original chocolate bar palette. I think they kind of hit the bar again this time. It kind of went down on the Semi-Sweet, but then when you got to the bonbons, it kind of hit it again. So I don't really have a con for that palette. The Too Faced Sweet Peach palette. This palette right now is like all the rage. They had like an original release where they released some palettes, but a lot of people couldn't get their hands on it. And then I guess there was so much customer feedback that we really wanted the palette back. So I think they brought it back, or they did bring it back, but I think that might have been the reason why. The pros for this palette, same as the chocolate bar palette, original chocolate bar palette. Also, the sparkly shades are better once again. Also, there's very unique shades in this palette. These shades are shades that I don't really have anywhere else in my collection. The con, okay, don't murder me, but I was not the biggest fan of this palette. I got it on the original release. I went right to Ulta and got it when it was released. For the first con, I just don't feel inspired by looking at this palette. It's not something, when I look at a good palette, I can just see many makeup looks come to life in my head. For this one, it just wasn't there. It lacks good transition shades. For me, like I said before, transition shade is mostly a matte. Okay, so the mattes go from very very light to dark. There's no in-between good matte transition shade. The color selections don't allow me to create many looks either. Next, we have the Too Faced Natural Eyes palette. The pros for this palette is there's good quality eyeshadow. It's the typical Too Faced quality, creamy, blendable, and pigmented. Which those are the 3 things I really look for when it comes to judging the quality of an eyeshadow. This palette is beginner friendly. It's a good neutral and natural palette. It's travel friendly, and there's good transition shades and a good mix of mattes and shimmers. The only con I have for this palette is there's not a lot of diversity. But then again, when you see natural eyes, you're getting a natural and neutral palette. You're not getting the diversity and pops of color. So it's not really something you can really be disappointed from because you know what you're getting when you buy it. Next is the Too Faced, I gotta say this, Boudoir? Yeah, I don't think that's right, but it's Boudoir Eyes. The pros for this palette is the quality is the same as the Natural Eyes palette. It's beginner friendly. This is a very sexy and sultry date night palette. It's also travel friendly. Cons, not as many matte shades, so it's not going to be, there's not as many good transition shades as the Natural Eyes palette. And there's not as much diversity. If you're using this palette, you're going to get a cool toned, purpley look, pretty much. And I mean, you're not really going to get much besides that, maybe like a gray look. But then again, you kind of see what you buy before you get it. Next, there's the Too Faced Cat Eyes palette. The pros for this is it's a very diverse and different palette. I don't really have another palette like this. It's good quality, like the Natural Eyes palette. It contains a good matte black. It's also travel friendly. The cons is only 2 mattes and no transition shades. For me, I have to have a transition shade unless I'm just using like one eyeshadow on the lid. I have to, non-negotiable, have to have it. So yeah, this palette, I don't feel inspired to make a tons of look using only this palette. For me, when I got this palette, I knew that it was going to be a 1-shade palette. So I kind of knew what I was getting into before I bought it. It wasn't a huge shocker. Next is the Too Faced Chocolate Shop palette. And this was this year's holiday palette. I believe it was the Sephora exclusive holiday palette. The pros for this palette, there's eyeshadow and face products. There's a good mix of warm and cool tones. This is a neutral palette, but with pretty pops of color. Too Faced does really good about adding in beautiful pops of color. That's kind of their thing. There's also good transition shades and a mix of mattes and shimmers. The cons for this palette is it's not a travel-friendly palette. It's going to fly right open, and then you're going to risk your shadows breaking, and nobody wants that. Also, the eyeshadow quality is hit and miss. This is not the normal Too Faced quality and formula. Honestly, though, when you're buying a holiday palette, you're not going to get the brand's normal quality. It's just not going to be there. So that is the bad part, but I mean, it's like that with every brand, so you kind of know what you're getting into once again. Next is the Tarte Energy Noir palette. I actually have a review on this palette. Excuse me, not a review, but a look using this palette, and I'll link it in the down bar below. So the price for this palette is very travel friendly. There's face and eye products. I love the highlighter in this palette. It's a good mix of shimmer and matte shades and good transition shades. It's a good quality, pigmented, blendable, and creamy. It's a cool tone lover's palette. If you are into warm tones, this palette is not for you at all. The cons for this palette is there's not a lot of different looks that can be made using just this palette. So that does suck. Next, we have the Tarte Tartelette and Bloom palette. I just got this palette for Christmas, and it has very quickly become my favorite eyeshadow palette in my collection. The price for this palette is it's travel friendly. There's a good mix of matte shimmers and lots of transition shades. Great quality, pigmented, blendable, creamy. It's beginner friendly, and it's a good neutral palette. Also, you have a mix of cool and warm tones, so it kind of suits what everybody wants, and you can create many looks using this palette. Honestly, I cannot think of one con about this palette that I personally do not like. Next, we have the Lorac Pro palette. The price for this palette is it's a good starting palette. You can create so many looks using this palette. It's good quality, pigmented, blendable, creamy. Amazing mix of matte and shimmers and good transitions. There's also cool tones and warm tones. I know that from the videos on YouTube that I've watched, a lot of makeup artists actually carry this in their kit because you can just create so much from using just this palette. The cons have to do with the actual packaging itself. The mirror breaks so easily. I know I watch a lot of palette collection videos on my YouTube, and that's why I wanted to create one, but almost every time that I see a Lorac Pro palette and you can tell it's kind of older, the mirror is almost always broken. I know it's broken, it's completely shattered on mine. And also, the palette gets dirty very fast. Like, the all black and the white to cream shade palettes are going to be the ones that get dirtiest the fastest. But it's also easily cleanable.
Easily cleanable. I don't even know if that cleanable is a word, but we'll go with it.
Next, we have the Lorac Pro Palette 3. The pros for this palette is there's an amazing mix of matte and shimmer shades and good transitions. There's a good mix of warm and cool tones. Also, there's good quality, creamy, pigmented, and blendable. The cons for this palette, the packaging is easily dirtied once again, but it cleans easily. Also, this is not a travel-friendly palette. I forgot to mention that for the Pro palette, the original one, that's not travel-friendly either. Next, we have my beloved Lorac Mega Pro 3. This is a good mix of matte and shimmers and a good transitions. Also, there's a good mix of warm and cool tones. This is a very diverse palette. You can create so many looks. You get a lot of bang for your buck. This is a good quality palette, creamy, blendable, pigmented. The only cons that I have for this palette is the packaging gets dirty very easily and they're not travel friendly. Next is the Smashbox Full Exposure. The pros for this palette is it's a good mix of mattes and shimmers, and there's also good transition shades. It's beginner friendly and a good neutral palette. Also, it's decent to good quality, just depending on what you like. It's pigmented and blendable, but it's not creamy. There's a good mix of warm and cool tones. It's travel friendly. The cons are shadows can be on the drier side. I know a lot of people think that this palette is drier and powdery. I don't think it's the driest thing I've ever had, but it's definitely not like my Too Faced palettes or my Lorac palettes. Also, it's not typically what I like. It's not diverse enough for me. Brown smoky eyes or brown eyeshadow is not really my thing. I use browns for transitions a lot, but I like pops of color. I like warm tones. This just isn't for me. Next is the Smashbox Double Exposure Palette. It's travel friendly, decent formula, pigmented and blendable. I don't know if it's just the palettes I got, but I felt the full exposure was better than the double exposure. There's some mix of shimmers and mattes, and there's also a mix of warm and cool tones. Cons: there's no transition shades whatsoever. There's not that good medium transition shade. There's no cool matte shades. One shade palette. This is a one shade palette for me. There is not a look I would want to create just using this palette. I was extremely unimpressed in this palette. Now, they say you can use, I think, the shimmer shades, wet or dry. I don't know about the matte ones. I might want to try that, but I just haven't yet. Next is the Buxom Customizable Eyeshadow Palette. Since I picked these shades out, there wasn't much I could say about the color selection. I picked shades that I did not have in my other palettes. So that's what this palette was for me. The pros, this is amazing quality eyeshadow. Pigmented, blendable, creamy. Their shimmers are my favorite shimmers on the market right now. The cons are the shadows. They're so creamy. You drop it once, it's going to shatter and it's going to break. Also, the packaging is easily broken. As you can see, one of my shades has completely fallen out of my pan. I don't know if you can tell, but my packaging did break. So that was very disappointing. Okay, and now we have the MAC 15 Pan Cool Neutral Palette. That was a mouthful. Okay, so the pros for this palette is it's a cool tone lovers palette. There's a good amount of diversity. There's a good amount of looks you can create. Very beginner friendly, I would say, because it's not super pigmented. When you're a beginner, I don't think, for me personally, I don't think a beginner should have really pigmented shadows, because when you're a beginner, especially for me, I did not know how much you had to blend. I was not good at blending. Now I feel like I've gotten a lot better, but just not for beginners, I feel. It's very travel friendly. It's good quality. It's blendable, creamy, and pigmented. It's not as pigmented as I wanted from MAC or expected, but it has pigmentation. I mean, it's not drugstore, but for the price and it being MAC, I really wanted pigmentation. And this was the first time I tried MAC shadows. Also, there's a good mix of matte and shimmers. The cons: you do not have a medium toned good transition shade. And I don't know if you can tell, but for me, that's a deal breaker for a palette. Also, this is not my favorite formula. I was extremely disappointed when I tried the MAC formula. It's expensive and it's MAC. And most of MAC's products are really good. But this, for me, just was not what I expected. Honestly, for me, I think Urban Decay and Too Faced and Lorac, that sounded so weird, and Tarte are way better than MAC. So yeah, just disappointing. Next, we have Benefit World Famous Neutrals. The pros for this palette is it's good quality eyeshadows, creamy, pigmented, and blendable. There's cream and powder products, and this is a cool tone lovers palette. The cons for this palette is there's no matte shades. Next, we have the Sephora Customizable Eyeshadow Palette. The pros for this palette is good quality eyeshadow and travel friendly. I don't have any cons for this eyeshadow palette because I picked out the shadows myself. Next, we have the Sephora More Than Meets the Eye. The pros for this palette is it's a good mix of warm and cool tone shades. Also, there's a good mix of shimmers and mattes, and there are transition shades. Also, it is a travel friendly. The cons for this palette is the shadows are hit and miss. Some are really great and some are not so good. Next, we have the e.l.f. Everyday Smoky Palette. The pros for this palette is it's travel friendly and good quality drugstore eyeshadow. Also, there's a good mix of shimmers, mattes, and transition shades. I don't really have a con for this palette because when you get into the drugstore palettes, I'm not as picky because, once again, you're paying for what you get, and it's not an expensive palette. If you pay $10, you're not going to get a Too Faced chocolate bar quality. But for $10, and this palette being drugstore, is very good quality. Next, we have the e.l.f. Prism Eyeshadow. The price for this palette is travel friendly and unique shimmer shades. The cons for this palette is it can be very powdery and you have to get through the layer of sparkly overspray that the companies add to the shadows to actually get pigmentation. When I first got this palette, I hated it. I was like, I'm not getting any pigmentation. What are people talking about? Because a lot of people love this palette and I just had to keep digging into it, and then I finally got pigmentation. I was like, oh, okay, this is decent. Next, we have the Wet n Wild Comfort Zone palette. The price for this palette is this great quality drugstore eyeshadow. To me, this is one of the best drugstore eyeshadow palettes in terms of quality. They're beautiful shades, travel friendly, and there are transition tone shades. No, there are not matte shades, but the tones of the shades are good transition tones. The cons for this palette, like I just said, there's no matte eyeshadow. Next, we have the Wet n Wild Poster Child. The pros is good drugstore quality, very unique shades, it's travel friendly. The cons, once again, no matte shades. Next, we have the Wet n Wild Petal Pusher. The pros for this palette is there's good drugstore quality, transition shades, and travel friendly. And when I say transition shades, once again, like the Comfort Zone palette is transition tones, so I wanted to clarify that up a little bit. And the cons, once again, no matte shades. Next, we have the L'Oreal La Palette Nude 1. The price for this palette is good drugstore quality, travel friendly. There's also a mix of shimmers and mattes and transition shades. The cons for this palette is it's expensive for a drugstore quality palette. It is $20 and you usually don't see that at the drugstore. Next is the L'Oreal La Palette Nude 2. The price for this is the same as Nude 1. The cons is also the same as Nude 1, is that it is expensive for a drugstore quality palette. Next is the Makeup Revolution Run Boy Run Salvation Palette. The price for this palette is it's travel friendly, a good drugstore quality palette with amazing shimmer shades. The quality of the shimmer shades are really, really good and above your normal average drugstore quality shimmer shades. And it's also a good mix of matte and shimmers, and there's great transitions in this palette. The cons for this palette is the mattes can be a little powdery, but it's slightly powdery. This is a really good drugstore palette, and I really recommend this palette. Next is the BH Cosmetics Carly Bible palette. This is the last palette. The price for this palette is it's good drugstore quality. Even though it's not drugstore brand, I still consider BH Cosmetics drugstore. Also, it's travel friendly in the face, and there's face and eye products. And lastly, for the cons, the shadows all blend into one shade. When I first tried this palette, the matte transition shades are so similar that when you're blending, they kind of all blend into the same shade. And also, all the products in this palette are really powdery. Most drugstore products are powdery, and this one is really, really powdery. This concludes my eyeshadow palette collection. Thank you guys so much for watching, and don't forget to subscribe and like. Thank you. Bye-bye.